Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about getting high. This is a story about how a simple plant became the most vilified substance in American history, not because of what it did to people, but because of who used it. Cowboys used it as medicine, presidents grew it, and then, almost overnight, it became the excuse to imprison millions. So if you're here for the full story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you want the truth, not the propaganda. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. The world is wide, and this plant touched every corner of it. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was no war, there was no prohibition, there was no controversy at all. There was only a plant growing wild on the wind-scoured steppes of Central Asia, somewhere in the vast emptiness between what we now call Mongolia and the Tibetan Plateau. A tall plant with jagged leaves and fibrous stalks, unremarkable to look at, but hiding within its cells a partnership that would stretch across 10,000 years of human history. We don't know who first pulled a hemp stalk from the earth and realized what they were holding. That moment is lost to time, buried beneath the sediment of countless generations. But we know it happened. Archaeological evidence tells us that humans and cannabis have been partners for at least 10 millennia, possibly longer. Seeds have been found in ancient campsites. Fiber impressions have been discovered pressed into pottery shards older than the pyramids. This relationship predates writing, it predates cities, it predates almost everything we think of as civilization. And here is what you must understand about this beginning. It was not about intoxication. The ancient peoples of the Neolithic age, those first farmers who abandoned the wandering life and began to shape the earth to their will, they did not discover cannabis because they wanted to get high. They discovered it because they wanted to survive. The Neolithic transition was one of the most profound shifts in human history. Nomads became settlers, hunters became farmers, and in this transformation, certain plants proved indispensable: wheat for bread, barley for beer, flax for linen, and hemp, cannabis sativa, for almost everything else. The fibers of the hemp plant were among the strongest in the natural world. When stripped from the stalk, dried in the sun, and twisted into rope, they could bear enormous weight without breaking. They could be woven into fabric that was durable, breathable, and resistant to rot. In a world where survival depended on ingenuity, where every resource had to serve multiple purposes, hemp was a gift beyond measure. It clothed bodies against the cold. It made the fishing nets that pulled food from rivers and seas. It became the bowstrings that brought down game. Every part of the plant was used. The seeds were eaten for nutrition or pressed for oil. The stalks provided fiber. Even the roots had their purposes. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could afford to be wasted. This was not counterculture. This was not rebellion. This was the foundation of culture itself. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, hemp cultivation had spread across the Asian continent, carried by migrating peoples, traded between settlements, planted wherever humans put down roots. It became as common as wheat or rice, and nowhere was it more revered than in ancient China. The Chinese did not merely use hemp, they venerated it. In the agricultural traditions that would shape one of history's greatest civilizations, hemp was listed among the 5 sacred grains, the wagyu, the foundational crops upon which society depended. This is remarkable when you consider that hemp is not actually a grain at all. But the Chinese understood something profound. Some plants are too important to be categorized by botany alone. Some plants must be measured by their service to humanity. And hemp served in ways that other crops could not match. The seeds were a vital food source, rich in protein and essential fatty acids. They were pressed for oil used in cooking and in lamps. The fibers were woven into cloth that dressed emperors and peasants alike. And perhaps most significantly, hemp became paper. The oldest known fragments of paper, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, were made from hemp fibers. Think about what that means. Before parchment, before wood pulp, before the paper industry that would transform human communication, there was hemp. The bureaucracies of ancient China, the imperial decrees, the poetry and philosophy that would echo through millennia, all of it was first recorded on sheets pressed from cannabis. But there was another use, one that would prove equally enduring. The Sheneng Benchao Jing, one of the world's oldest pharmacopoeias, listed cannabis as a remedy for a remarkable range of ailments: gout, rheumatism, malaria, constipation, even absent-mindedness. The legendary Emperor Shennong, the divine farmer who is credited with founding Chinese agriculture and medicine, allegedly prescribed cannabis preparations as early as 2737 BCE. Now, whether Shennong was a historical figure or a mythologized composite, we cannot say with certainty, but the legend itself tells us something true. Cannabis was not a fringe medicine in ancient China. It was not hidden in shadows or whispered about in secret. It was mainstream, it was official, it was prescribed by the father of Chinese medicine himself. This was not counterculture, this was the establishment. But hemp was more than utility, more than fiber and food and medicine. In certain cultures, at certain times, it became something else entirely. It became a doorway. The Scythians understood this. If you have not heard of the Scythians, you should know them. They were among the most fearsome peoples of the ancient world, nomadic horsemen who thundered across the steppes from the Black Sea to the borders of China. They were warriors and traders, craftsmen of exquisite gold jewelry, and practitioners of rituals that would be recorded by one of history's first great historians. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described Scythian customs with the careful eye of an anthropologist. And what he described has since been confirmed by archaeology. After a burial, he wrote, the Scythians would construct small tents, sealing them tight against the outside air. Inside, they would place a dish of red-hot stones, and onto those stones they would throw hemp seeds. The tent would fill with thick aromatic smoke. The mourners inside would inhale deeply, and they would howl, Herodotus tells us. They would howl with pleasure. For decades, some scholars dismissed this account as exaggeration or misunderstanding, but then the tombs were open. In the frozen burial mounds of Siberia, archaeologists discovered Scythian remains preserved by permafrost for over 2,000 years, and beside them they found bronze vessels still containing hemp seeds. They found the apparatus of ritual exactly as Herodotus had described. This was not recreation in the modern sense. The Scythians were not getting high for entertainment. This was sacrament. This was ceremony. When a chieftain died, his people gathered in the smoke to honour his passage, to commune perhaps with his departing spirit, to touch for a moment the boundary between the living and the dead. This was not recreation, this was religion, a way to reach beyond the material world and touch something transcendent. As the great trade routes expanded, as caravans loaded with silk and spices wound their way across mountains and deserts, cannabis travelled with them. It moved west into Persia and the Arab lands, it moved south into Africa, and it moved into India, where it would find what many consider its spiritual home. In the Hindu tradition, cannabis became intertwined with Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation, the lord of yoga and meditation, the deity who sits in eternal contemplation atop Mount Kailash. Legend held that Shiva himself consumed bhang, a preparation of ground cannabis leaves mixed with milk, honey, and spices. It was said to bring clarity of mind, to aid in the long hours of meditation, to open doors of perception that remained closed to ordinary consciousness. Bhang was not hidden. It was not forbidden. It was consumed openly during festivals, particularly Holi, the festival of colours that marks the arrival of spring. Holy men, sadhus and yogis who had renounced worldly possessions in their search for enlightenment used cannabis as a tool in their spiritual practice. In the high Himalayas, in the temple cities of the Ganges, in the ashrams where seekers gathered to study ancient wisdom, cannabis was present, and it remains so today. Bhang is still legal in India. You can buy it at government-licensed shops. It is offered at certain temples as prasad, a blessed offering. While much of the world would come to view cannabis as dangerous, as corrupting, as a threat to social order, in India it remained what it had always been, a plant with sacred associations woven into the spiritual fabric of a civilization. From India, cannabis continued its spread along the Silk Road to the Middle East, where it would become hashish, across the Red Sea into East Africa, through trade networks that connected the ancient world in ways we are still discovering. Everywhere humans travelled, cannabis travelled with them. Everywhere humans settled, cannabis took root. It was medicine in one place, textile in another, sacrament in a third. It was versatile beyond almost any other plant, and it was everywhere. A silent partner in the great unfolding of human civilization. But in the West, the story was different. The Greeks knew of cannabis. Herodotus wrote about it. Other writers mentioned its fibers, its uses in rope and sail. The Romans knew it too. They used hemp for the rigging of their ships, for the ropes that bound their empire together. Cannabis was present in the ancient Mediterranean world, but something curious happened. Or rather, something curious did not happen. The psychoactive properties of cannabis, the effects that the Scythians howled over, that the sadhus meditated upon, never took hold in European culture, not in Greece, not in Rome, not in the medieval kingdoms that rose from Rome's ashes. Why? We cannot say with certainty. Perhaps it was climate? The cannabis that grew in the cooler European regions was hemp, bred over generations for fiber strength rather than psychoactive potency. Perhaps it was cultural. The Greeks had their wine, the symbol of Dionysus. The Romans had their wine as well. Alcohol was already the intoxicant of the West, woven into religious ritual and social custom. Perhaps there was simply no need for another doorway when one was already so well established. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. For Europeans, cannabis was a crop, not a sacrament. It was useful, not mystical. It made rope and sail and cloth. It served practical purposes, but it did not transport the soul. It did not open doors to other worlds. And so an equilibrium was established. For millennia, this was the state of things. Cannabis existed in dozens of forms across dozens of cultures, each using it according to their needs and beliefs. It was medicine in China, rope in Rome, a sacred intoxicant in India, a mourning ritual among the Scythians. It was ubiquitous and unremarkable, as common as wheat, as uncontroversial as wool. No one feared it, no one demonized it, no government declared war upon it. It was simply a plant, and like all plants, it served. Then the world changed, and everything that had been true for 10,000 years would be overturned in less than 100. The world was about to get much larger, and hemp would make it possible. When European sailors first pushed beyond the horizon, when they ventured into waters no European had ever crossed, when they began the age of exploration that would reshape the entire planet, they did so on ships held together by cannabis. Every rope that hauled a sail, every line that secured a mast, every cable that dropped an anchor into unknown waters, every bit of caulking that kept the ocean from pouring through the hull, all of it was hemp. This was not incidental. This was essential. A single large warship, a vessel of the line capable of projecting imperial power across oceans, required more than 50 tons of hemp for its construction. 50 tons? And that hemp had to be replaced regularly because salt water and sun degraded the fibers. The navies of Europe consumed hemp at a staggering rate, and their hunger for it never ceased. Consider what this meant. The great maritime powers of the age, Britain and Spain and France and Portugal, the nations that would carve up the world among themselves, depended on hemp the way modern militaries depend on oil. It was a strategic resource of the highest order. Wars were fought over access to it. Alliances were forged to secure its supply. The Baltic states, particularly Russia, became vital trading partners because their cold climates produced hemp of exceptional quality. Without hemp, there would have been no Age of Sail, no Spanish galleons laden with New World silver, no British East India Company, no triangular trade, no global empires at all. The tall ships that carried European ambition across the seas were, in a very real sense, floating hemp platforms. So when those ships reached new shores, when colonizers stepped onto beaches in the Americas and the Caribbean and beyond, one of the first things they did was plant hemp. In 1606, a French botanist named Louis Hébert planted the first hemp crop in North America in what is now Nova Scotia. The English followed in Virginia just 5 years later. The pattern repeated everywhere Europeans established colonies. The plant that had served humanity for 10,000 years was now serving empire. In the English colonies of North America, hemp was not merely encouraged, it was demanded. The Virginia Assembly passed laws requiring every farmer to grow hemp. This was not a suggestion. Failure to cultivate the crop could result in fines. In some cases, it could result in imprisonment. The colonial authorities understood what the empire needed, and they were prepared to compel their subjects to provide it. Hemp was too important to be left to individual choice. And so hemp grew across the colonies. It grew in Virginia and Maryland. It grew in Massachusetts and Connecticut. It grew on the plantations of the South and the small farms of the North. It was woven into the economic fabric of a society that did not yet know it would become a nation. The men who had found that nation were themselves hemp farmers. George Washington cultivated hemp at Mount Vernon. His diaries contain detailed notes about planting, harvesting, and processing the crop. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello. He invented a device to improve the processing of hemp fibers. Benjamin Franklin owned a paper mill that processed hemp into the sheets upon which colonial ideas would be recorded and distributed. The first drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper. Think about that for a moment. The document that announced the birth of a new nation, that declared certain truths to be self-evident, was composed on pages pressed from cannabis fibers. In some colonies, hemp was so valuable that it could be used to pay taxes. It was, quite literally, money. As the new nation expanded westward, hemp went with it. The canvas that covered the wagons rolling across the Great Plains was hemp. The word canvas itself derives from cannabis. The ropes that pioneers used to ford rivers, to raise barns, to tame a wilderness were hemp. When Levi Strauss began manufacturing durable pants for gold prospectors in California, he made them from hemp denim fabric tough enough to withstand the brutal demands of mining camps. This was not counterculture. This was not the province of outcasts and rebels. This was the backbone of the Republic, a crop cultivated by presidents, mandated by law, woven into the very identity of a young nation. But here the story begins to split. Here a single plant begins to lead a double life. The hemp that grew in American fields, that clothed soldiers and rigged ships and covered wagons, was a variety of cannabis sativa bred over countless generations for a specific purpose. Farmers wanted tall plants with long, strong fibers. They wanted stalks, not flowers. And so they selected for those traits, generation after generation, until they had created a plant optimized for industry. This industrial hemp contained very little tetrahydrocannabinol, the chemical compound that produces the marijuana high. You could smoke an entire field of it and feel nothing but a headache and regret. It was a work plant, a useful plant, but not an intoxicating one. In other parts of the world, however, different varieties had been cultivated for different purposes. In India, in Mexico, in the Caribbean, in parts of Africa, growers had selected not for fiber, but for flowers. They wanted plants that produced abundant resin, rich in the compounds that altered consciousness. Cannabis indica and certain sativa strains had been bred for their psychoactive properties, for the hashish and bang and ganja that had been consumed for centuries. These were not the same plant, not in any practical sense. They shared a species, yes, but they had been shaped by human hands into fundamentally different tools. One made rope, the other opened doors in the mind. For most of history, these two worlds existed separately. The hemp farmers of Kentucky had nothing in common with the hashish users of Morocco. But as global trade and migration accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries, as people and products moved across borders in unprecedented numbers, these two worlds would collide. And in that collision, a century of chaos would be born. While hemp fields spread across America, European doctors were making discoveries in distant colonies that would bring cannabis into the Western medicine cabinet. In the 1830s and 1840s, physicians stationed in British India began documenting what local practitioners had known for millennia. Cannabis had remarkable therapeutic properties. The most influential of these colonial doctors was an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, working in Kolkata. He conducted extensive experiments with cannabis preparations and published his findings in 1839. His results were extraordinary. Cannabis tinctures were effective against muscle spasms. They relieved the pain of rheumatism. Most dramatically, they could stop convulsions, including the seizures that had resisted every other treatment. O'Shaughnessy brought samples back to England, and word of his research spread rapidly through the medical establishment. Within 2 decades, cannabis had crossed the Atlantic and entered the American pharmacopoeia. By the 1850s, it was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of recognized medicines. You could walk into any pharmacy in the country and purchase cannabis preparations without a prescription. Tinctures, extracts, pills, all were readily available. They were marketed for an impressive range of conditions: migraines, menstrual cramps, insomnia, neuralgia, even coughs and colds. The major pharmaceutical companies of the era all produced cannabis-based medications: Park Davis, Eli Lilly, Squibb. These were not fringe operations peddling snake oil. These were the leading names in American medicine, and they saw cannabis as a legitimate and valuable therapeutic tool. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of experimentation was underway. In Paris in the 1840s, a group of writers and artists formed a club they called Le Club des Hachishans, the Club of the Hashish Eaters. Its members included some of the greatest names in French literature: Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo. They would gather in a hotel on the Ile Saint-Louis, consume a thick paste of cannabis mixed with honey and spices, and spend the evening exploring the altered states it produced. Baudelaire wrote extensively about his experiences, describing how the drug distorted time, amplified sensations, and unlocked visions of strange beauty. He also warned of its seductions, the way it could draw the user into passive dreamscapes that sapped ambition and will. This was cannabis as exotic intellectual curiosity, bohemian and transgressive, tinged with the glamour of the Orient. But these artistic explorations remained marginal. The general public had no interest in smoking hashish. They had their tinctures from the pharmacy, prescribed by doctors for legitimate ailments. Cannabis was medicine, respectable and mainstream, sold by reputable companies and used by ordinary citizens. No stigma, no moral panic, no politicians railing against its dangers. It was simply medicine, one of dozens of herbal remedies available to anyone who needed it. That would change. Everything would change. But in the closing decades of the 19th century, as the Victorian era gave way to the modern age, cannabis occupied an unremarkable place in Western life. It was useful, it was legal, it was everywhere, and no one could have predicted what was coming. The 20th century arrived with the promise of progress. Electricity was spreading across cities. Automobiles were beginning to crowd out horses. The old world was giving way to the new. But progress always has its shadow, and in America, that shadow fell across the southern border. In 1910, Mexico erupted. The Mexican Revolution, one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Western Hemisphere, tore the country apart. Armies clashed, villages burned, famine spread, and hundreds of thousands of Mexicans, desperate to escape the chaos, fled north into the United States. They came to Texas, to New Mexico, to Arizona and California. They came seeking work, seeking safety, seeking survival. They took jobs in agriculture, picking cotton and citrus under a brutal sun. They worked the railroads, laying track across deserts that seemed to stretch forever. They labored in mines, extracting the wealth that built American cities while breathing the dust that would destroy their lungs. And they brought with them their customs, their language, their music, their food. And among those customs was the smoking of marijuana. This was not exotic to them. In Mexico, cannabis had been used for centuries, particularly among the working poor and the soldiers who fought the endless wars. It was cheap. It was accessible. After a day of backbreaking labor, it offered a few hours of relief. A brief escape from exhaustion and pain. There was no moral weight attached to it, no sense of transgression. It was simply part of life. But to many Americans watching this influx of foreign workers, these unfamiliar people with their unfamiliar tongue and their unfamiliar ways, marijuana became something else entirely. It became a flashpoint, a symbol, a way to channel the anxieties that always accompany demographic change into something concrete and controllable. The plant became a weapon in a cultural war, and that war was about to begin in earnest. Pay attention to words. Words shape perception, and perception shapes policy. The word that would be used to demonize cannabis was chosen with calculated precision. For decades, Americans had known this plant as cannabis. They had purchased cannabis tinctures from pharmacies. Their doctors had prescribed cannabis for everything from migraines to menstrual cramps. Cannabis was medicine, respectable and familiar. But marijuana was something else. Marijuana was a Spanish word, a Mexican word. It was foreign, it was alien, it sounded dangerous in a way that cannabis never had. And so the crusaders against the plant deliberately, consciously chose to call it marijuana. They wanted to sever the connection between the medicine in American cabinets and the smoke in Mexican workers' pipes. They wanted to make it seem like something new, something imported, something that did not belong, and then they told stories. Local newspapers, particularly in Texas, began running sensationalized accounts of marijuana-crazed Mexicans committing terrible crimes. The drug was blamed for violence, for insanity, for moral decay of every description. Headlines screamed warnings about the menace spreading north from the border. Editorials demanded action before it was too late. There was no evidence behind these stories, no rigorous investigation, no scientific analysis, just fear dressed up as news. The marijuana menace was a creation of prejudice and panic, and it served a very specific purpose. In 1914, the city of El Paso, Texas, became one of the first jurisdictions in the United States to ban the sale and possession of marijuana. The stated reason was public safety. The actual reason was transparent to everyone involved. The city council wanted to control the growing Mexican population, and criminalizing their drug of choice gave the police a powerful tool to do exactly that. The pattern repeated across the Southwest. State after state passed anti-marijuana laws, almost always in regions with significant Mexican immigrant populations. By the 1920s, more than a dozen states had criminalized the plant. The legal foundation for the war on marijuana was being laid, one racist ordinance at a time. But Mexicans were not the only target. In the cities of the North, another group was being marked. The Great Migration was transforming urban America. Millions of African Americans, fleeing the violence and oppression of the Jim Crow South, moved to cities like Chicago and Detroit, New York and Philadelphia. They brought their labor, their culture, and their music. And in the smoky underground clubs of New Orleans and Kansas City, in the dance halls of Harlem and the speakeasies of the South Side, that music was jazz. Jazz was something new. It was improvised, unpredictable, alive, with a freedom that structured European music had never possessed. It was sensual in ways that made respectable society uncomfortable. And it was in the eyes of white America dangerously black. The musicians who created this revolution discovered that marijuana enhanced their art. It slowed time, allowing them to hear spaces between notes that sober perception missed. It heightened sensation, making each phrase more vivid, each chord more resonant. It relaxed inhibitions, freeing the improvisational flights that were the heart of jazz. Louis Armstrong was a lifelong cannabis user. He called it gauge, and he credited it with relaxing him, with making his music flow more freely. He was arrested for marijuana possession in 1930 outside a Los Angeles club and spent 9 days in jail before his white manager arranged his release. It barely slowed him down. He would continue smoking and making music for another 40 years. Cab Calloway sang about it openly. His 1932 recording Reefer Man was a playful, coded tribute to the drug and the culture surrounding it. The song was a hit, played on radio stations across the country, and everyone who heard it understood exactly what it was about. But what was celebrated within the black jazz community was viewed with alarm by white America. Jazz itself was seen as a threat, as primitive and corrupting, as an assault on decent values. And marijuana became inextricably linked with that threat. It was the drug of black musicians, of black culture, of black people whose very presence in northern cities unsettled the established order. The pattern was now clear. Marijuana was associated with Mexicans in the Southwest and with African Americans in the urban North. It was the drug of the other, of communities that the establishment viewed as dangerous, as undesirable, as needing to be controlled. The drug war was never primarily about public health. It was never primarily about pharmacology. It was about power. It was about using the law to suppress communities that those in power wished to suppress. Every crusade needs a crusader. Every war needs a general. And in 1930, the war on marijuana found its commander. His name was Harry Jacob Anslinger. He was appointed the first commissioner of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a position he would hold for the next 32 years. He was a bureaucrat by training, a moralist by temperament, and a propagandist of extraordinary skill, and he would dedicate his career to a single mission: the complete eradication of marijuana. In his early years, Anslinger paid little attention to cannabis. His focus was on opiates and cocaine, the drugs that had been federally regulated since the Harrison Act of 1914. But as the Great Depression deepened and budgets tightened, as Congress began questioning whether the Bureau of Narcotics was worth its funding, Anslinger needed a new enemy. He needed a new crusade to justify his agency's existence. Marijuana was perfect. It was largely unregulated at the federal level. It was associated with despised minority groups, and it could be made to seem terrifying with the right kind of publicity. Anslinger launched a media campaign that was relentless, systematic, and almost entirely divorced from truth. He cultivated relationships with newspaper editors across the country. He fed them stories. He supplied them with quotes. He became a one-man factory of anti-marijuana propaganda, and the press, always hungry for sensational content, eagerly printed what he provided. The claims were extraordinary. Marijuana, Anslinger insisted, made users violent beyond reason. It drove them to insanity. It unleashed sexual deviance. It was, he said, more dangerous than heroin, more destructive than cocaine, a threat to the very foundations of civilization. He collected what he called gore files, sensationalized accounts of crimes allegedly committed under the influence of marijuana. The most famous was the case of Victor Licata, a young man in Florida who murdered his family with an axe in 1933. Anslinger cited this case obsessively, pointing to it as proof of what marijuana could do to an otherwise normal person. What he did not mention was that Licata had a long documented history of severe mental illness. What he did not mention was that there was no evidence Licata had ever used marijuana. The truth was irrelevant. The story was useful, and Anslinger used it. His racism was not hidden. It was not subtle. In testimony before Congress, in private correspondence, in public statements, Anslinger spoke openly of reefer-crazed Negroes, of the threat marijuana posed to white women, of the sexual deviancy it would unleash. He warned that marijuana caused white women to seek relations with black men. He warned that it would lead to race mixing, to the breakdown of the barriers that kept America's racial hierarchy intact. He understood something essential about political persuasion. Fear works. Racial fear works best of all. And so he fed fear to a nation already anxious about immigrants and black people and the changes reshaping society. He gave that fear a name and a face. He gave it marijuana. Hollywood, never one to miss a profitable panic, joined the campaign. In 1936, a film was released that would become the defining artifact of marijuana hysteria. Originally titled Tell Your Children, it would become known by another name, Reefer Madness. The film depicted marijuana as a one-way ticket to destruction. Clean-cut teenagers are lured to a party where marijuana is present. Within minutes, they are transformed. One hallucinates wildly. Another plays piano with manic intensity. A young woman is sexually assaulted. A young man commits vehicular manslaughter. The film ends with suicide, murder, and the complete breakdown of everything decent and good. It was absurd. It was over the top. It bore no resemblance to the actual effects of cannabis on actual human beings, but it was distributed to schools and churches across the country as educational material. Parents watched it with their children. Teachers screened it for students. The message was clear. Marijuana was death. By 1937, Anslinger had built enough momentum to push for federal legislation. The result was the Marijuana Tax Act. It did not outright criminalize marijuana that would have raised constitutional questions about federal power. Instead, it imposed a system of taxes and regulations so burdensome that compliance was virtually impossible. Anyone who wanted to cultivate, prescribe, or sell cannabis would have to register, file paperwork, and pay fees that most could not afford. It was prohibition dressed in bureaucratic clothing. During the congressional hearings, a lone voice of opposition emerged. Dr. William Woodward, representing the American Medical Association, testified against the bill. He pointed out that cannabis had legitimate medical uses. He noted that there was no scientific evidence for the claims of violence and insanity. He observed that the term marijuana was being deliberately used to obscure the fact that Congress was banning a medicine that doctors had prescribed for decades. His testimony was ignored. The committee members dismissed him with contempt. One congressman asked why the AMA opposed a bill designed to stop addiction. Woodward replied that the AMA did not oppose stopping addiction. He opposed passing bad legislation based on lies. It did not matter. The industrial hemp farmers objected too. They argued that hemp cultivation was vital for rope, textiles, and paper production. Some historians have noted that synthetic fiber companies like DuPont, which had just patented nylon, and paper companies that had invested in wood pulp processing, may have quietly supported the elimination of a competitor. Whether this was conspiracy or mere confluence of interest remains debated, but the result was the same. The Marijuana Tax Act passed with little opposition. Few members of Congress understood what they were voting on. Fewer still cared. It was a bill to control a dangerous drug used by Mexicans and black people. That was enough. And so, almost overnight, a plant that had been cultivated for 10,000 years, that had clothed armies and healed the sick and helped build a nation, became contraband. The war had been declared, the enemy had been named, and for the next 80 years, that war would escalate beyond anything Harry Anslinger could have imagined. History has a bitter sense of humour. Just 5 years after Congress declared war on marijuana, the United States found itself desperately needing the very plant it had criminalised. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and within months, Japanese military advances across the Pacific had severed a supply line that few Americans had ever thought about, but that the military could not function without. The Philippines airplanes fell, and with them fell America's access to Manila hemp. Now, Manila hemp was not actually hemp at all. It was abaca, a different plant entirely, but it served the same purpose that cannabis hemp had served for centuries. It made rope. Strong rope. The kind of rope that rigged naval vessels and secured cargo and, critically, formed the webbing of parachutes. Without it, American soldiers could not jump from airplanes. American ships could not sail. The war effort itself was in jeopardy. The government faced an impossible choice. Admit that the prohibition it had championed was inconvenient and reverse course, or watch the military struggle for lack of rope. Ideology met necessity, and necessity won. In 1942, the United States Department of Agriculture released a propaganda film called Hemp for Victory. The same government that had spent years demonizing cannabis was now urging American farmers to grow it. The film was earnest, patriotic, and utterly lacking in any acknowledgement of the contradiction it represented. Farmers who grew hemp would be exempt from military service. They would be heroes, contributing to the war effort from their fields. More than 400,000 acres of hemp were planted across the Midwest. The crop that had been branded a menace, a destroyer of youth, a corrupter of women, was suddenly essential to national defense. The plant demonized 5 years earlier was suddenly a hero, and then the war ended. The tolerance ended with it. The hemp fields were ploughed under, the processing facilities were shuttered, the farmers who had answered their country's call went back to other crops, and the Hemp for Victory program was not merely ended but erased. For decades, the federal government denied that the film had ever existed. Officials insisted that no such propaganda had been produced, that the government had never encouraged hemp cultivation, that the whole thing was a myth. It was not a myth. Copies of the film were eventually discovered in the Library of Congress in the National Archives, proof of a truth that those in power had tried to bury. But by then, the war on marijuana had resumed as if it had never been interrupted, and the awkward interlude of Hemp for Victory had been scrubbed from official memory. In the post-war years, marijuana remained at the margins of American life. The soldiers had come home. The suburbs were spreading. A culture of conformity had settled over the country. A desperate normalcy after the trauma of depression and war. People wanted stability. They wanted predictability. They wanted to believe that the future would be better than the past, and that everyone would share in the prosperity. Marijuana had no place in this vision. It remained associated with the fringes, with jazz musicians in smoky clubs, with Mexican laborers in the fields of the Southwest, with anyone who existed outside the neat boundaries of respectable society. The average American in 1950 had probably never seen marijuana, certainly never smoked it, and had no desire to. But there were those who rejected the conformity. There were those who looked at the neat lawns and identical houses and grey flannel suits and saw not security but suffocation. They called themselves the Beats. Jack Kerouac, writing feverish prose about driving across America in search of something he could never quite name. Allen Ginsberg, howling poetry that indicted a civilization he saw as spiritually dead. William S. Burroughs, chronicling addiction and alienation in language that broke every rule of polite literature. The Beats embraced marijuana as part of their rejection of everything their parents' generation held dear. It was not merely a drug to them, it was a statement, a refusal, a way of declaring that they would not be assimilated into the great grey mass of American normalcy. They were outliers, their influence was limited, their audience small. Most Americans in the 1950s had never heard of Jack Kerouac, would have been baffled by Allen Ginsberg, would have been horrified by William S. Burroughs. The Beats existed in a parallel world, visible only to those who sought them out. But seeds, once planted, have a way of growing. The Beats would not change America directly, but they would inspire those who would. Then came the 1960s, and everything changed. It is difficult now to convey the scale of what happened, the speed of it, the sense that an entire civilization was coming apart at the seams. A generation of young people, the largest in American history, raised in unprecedented prosperity, educated in unprecedented numbers, looked at the world their parents had built and rejected it. They rejected the war in Vietnam, the endless slaughter in a country most Americans could not find on a map. They rejected the racism that still segregated schools and lunch counters and neighborhoods. They rejected the stifling expectations of conformity, the assumption that everyone would follow the same path: school, job, marriage, house, children, death. And they embraced drugs. Not just marijuana, though marijuana was central. LSD and mescaline and mushrooms, substances that promised to expand consciousness, to reveal hidden truths, to break down the barriers that separated the self from the universe. But marijuana was the gateway, the sacrament, the substance that united this sprawling, chaotic movement. It spread like nothing before it, from the jazz clubs and beat coffee houses into college campuses, into suburban bedrooms, into the vast, sprawling consciousness of a generation that was questioning everything their parents had told them. To smoke marijuana in 1967 was to declare yourself opposed to the Vietnam War, opposed to racism, opposed to the emptiness of consumer culture. It was a political act wrapped in rolling papers. Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco became a pilgrimage site, a place where young people gathered to drop out, tune in, and build something new. Kent State became a symbol of how violently the establishment would respond to dissent. Woodstock became a legend. 500,000 people gathered in a muddy field to listen to music and imagine a different world. The establishment was horrified, but this time the horror had a different character. The marijuana users were not Mexicans or black jazz musicians. They were white. They were middle class. They were the sons and daughters of respectable families, the young people who were supposed to inherit and perpetuate the American dream. Parents were terrified. What had happened to their children? What had corrupted them? Politicians saw the terror and smelled opportunity. If parents were scared, if voters were scared, then the politician who promised to restore order, to punish the deviants, to make America normal again, that politician would win. Richard Nixon understood this better than anyone. His 1968 presidential campaign was built on a simple promise: law and order. The chaos in the streets, the protests, the riots, the assassinations, all of it would end. Nixon would restore stability. Nixon would punish the troublemakers. Nixon would make America safe again. To Nixon and his advisors, the counterculture was not merely a cultural movement. It was a political enemy. The anti-war protesters threatened Nixon's foreign policy. The civil rights activists threatened the racial order that Nixon's Southern strategy depended upon. They had to be stopped. But how do you stop a movement? How do you arrest an idea? You arrest the people who hold the idea, and you use their habits as the excuse. Years later, in 1994, a journalist named Dan Baum interviewed John Ehrlichman, who had served as Nixon's domestic policy advisor. Ehrlichman, by then disgraced and dying, offered a confession that should have shattered every assumption about the war on drugs. It did not. Most Americans never heard it, but it was recorded. It was documented, and it reveals the truth that had always been hiding in plain sight. This is what John Ehrlichman said. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Read that again. Let it sink in. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is a direct statement from one of the architects of the drug war, explaining precisely what it was designed to accomplish. The war on drugs was never about drugs. It was about suppressing political opposition. It was about controlling black communities. It was about using the law as a weapon against anyone who threatened the status quo. They knew they were lying. Of course they did. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law, creating the framework that would govern drug policy for the next half-century and beyond. The Act established 5 schedules for classifying drugs based on 2 criteria: accepted medical use and potential for abuse. Schedule. I was the most restrictive, reserved for substances deemed to have no medical value and a high potential for abuse. Schedule 2 was for dangerous drugs that nonetheless had recognized medical applications, and so on down through Schedules III, IV, and V. Marijuana was placed in Schedule Y, the same category as heroin, the same category as LSD, above cocaine, which was placed in Schedule 2, above methamphetamine, also Schedule 2. According to the federal government, marijuana was more dangerous, more addictive, and less medically useful than cocaine and meth. This classification was not based on science. It was not based on evidence. It was not based on the recommendations of medical professionals or the findings of researchers. It was based on politics. We know this because Nixon commissioned his own study. The Schaefer Commission, formerly known as the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, spent 2 years conducting the most comprehensive investigation of cannabis ever undertaken by the federal government. They reviewed the scientific literature, they interviewed experts, they examined the actual effects of the drug on actual users. Their conclusion, delivered to Nixon in 1972, was unambiguous. Marijuana should be decriminalized. The criminal penalties for personal use were doing more harm than the drug itself. The commission recommended treating marijuana more like alcohol, regulated but not prohibited. Nixon rejected the report. He did not merely disagree with it, he buried it. He refused to even read it. The Schaefer Commission's recommendations were ignored, and the Schedule Y classification remained in place. The classification was not based on science. It was based on politics, and politics in this case meant war. The war had been declared. Now the army would be built. In 1973, Richard Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration, consolidating federal drug enforcement powers into a single agency with unprecedented reach. The DEA would coordinate efforts across jurisdictions, share intelligence, conduct international operations, and serve as the spearhead of what Nixon had officially declared to be a war on drugs. But the DEA was only the tip of the spear. Beneath it, a vast apparatus of enforcement spread across every level of government. State police received federal grants tied to drug arrests. Local departments received military equipment, armored vehicles, and automatic weapons and surveillance technology, all justified by the need to fight the drug war. The line between soldier and police officer began to blur until, in many communities, it disappeared entirely. Congress, eager to appear tough on crime, passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws. These statutes stripped judges of their traditional discretion. It no longer mattered if a defendant was a first-time offender, if they had a family, if they posed no threat to society. If they were convicted of certain drug offenses, the sentence was predetermined. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. The individual circumstances were irrelevant. The law was a machine, and the machine demanded bodies. The numbers that resulted are difficult to comprehend. Between 1965 and 2020, over 26 million Americans were arrested for marijuana offences. 26 million. That is more than the entire population of Australia. More than the population of New York State. If marijuana arrestees were their own country, it would be one of the 50 largest nations on Earth. And here is what makes this statistic even more staggering. Approximately 88% of those arrests were for simple possession, not trafficking, not dealing, not running drug empires. Possession, users caught with small amounts, often just enough for personal use. Young people, mostly. People who posed no threat to anyone except, perhaps, themselves. 26 million Americans, the vast majority of them guilty of nothing more than having a plant in their pocket, fed into a criminal justice system that would mark them for life. The machinery of enforcement did not operate equally. It was never designed to. Study after study, conducted over decades by researchers with no political agenda, has confirmed the same finding. White Americans and Black Americans use marijuana at roughly the same rates. The numbers vary slightly depending on methodology, but the conclusion is consistent. There is no meaningful difference in marijuana consumption between racial groups. And yet Black Americans are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans. In some states, the disparity is even more extreme. In Montana, Black people are nearly 10 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than white people, despite making up less than 1% of the state's population. In Iowa, in Illinois, in Minnesota, and the District of Columbia, the disparities are similarly grotesque. Let me be clear about what this means. If you are a white college student smoking marijuana in your dorm room, your chances of being arrested are relatively low. If you are a Black teenager smoking the exact same substance on a street corner in the same city, your chances of being arrested are exponentially higher. Same drug, same behavior, radically different outcomes based entirely on the color of your skin. This is not accidental. This is policy. The enforcement practices that create these disparities have names. Stop and frisk, which gave police the power to detain and search anyone based on vague suspicions, was deployed overwhelmingly in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Broken windows policing, which flooded communities with officers looking for minor offenses, turned marijuana possession into a gateway to the criminal justice system. No-knock raids, which sent armed officers crashing through doors in the middle of the night, were conducted almost exclusively in communities of color. Marijuana was the lowest hanging fruit. It was the easiest charge to bring. A cop who wanted to boost his arrest numbers, who wanted to justify his department's drug war funding, could rack up marijuana possession charges with minimal effort. Pull over a car, smell marijuana, make an arrest. Stop someone on the street, find a joint, make an arrest. The drug war gave law enforcement virtually unlimited discretion, and that discretion was exercised along racial lines with devastating consistency. Marijuana became the on-ramp to mass incarceration, a minor offense that for millions of Americans would be the first step into a system designed to crush them. The consequences of a marijuana conviction did not end when the handcuffs came off. For many, of course, there was prison. Time behind bars, weeks or months or years, depending on the jurisdiction and the quantity and whether mandatory minimums applied. Time away from families, time away from jobs, time in facilities designed to punish rather than rehabilitate, where violence was common and hope was scarce. But the prison sentence, terrible as it was often just the beginning. A drug conviction creates a permanent criminal record. That record follows you for the rest of your life. It appears on every job application that asks about criminal history, and most do. It appears on every housing application. It appears on every background check conducted by landlords, employers, licensing boards, volunteer organizations. The conviction may be decades old. The offense may have been minor. It does not matter. The record remains. A marijuana conviction can render you ineligible for federal student loans, closing the door to higher education for those who cannot afford to pay out of pocket. It can disqualify you from public housing, leaving you homeless or dependent on family. It can strip you of eligibility for food stamps, pushing you deeper into poverty. It can cost you professional licenses, ending careers that took years to build. In many states, it can take away your right to vote, silencing your political voice. In custody disputes, it can be used to take away your children. A single joint could derail an entire life, and the damage radiated outward. Children grew up with parents in prison. Families lost their primary breadwinners and never recovered financially. Communities watched generation after generation of their young men disappear into the criminal justice system, and the social fabric that held neighborhoods together was torn to shreds. In the 1980s, private prisons emerged, corporations that contracted with states to house inmates for profit. Their business model depended on one thing: high incarceration rates. Empty beds meant lost revenue, and so these companies lobbied for tougher sentences, for more enforcement, for policies that would keep the cells full. The prison industrial complex was born, and marijuana arrests provided a steady stream of inventory. We built an industry on human suffering, and we called it justice. Here is the cruelest irony of all. None of it worked. Marijuana use did not decline during the decades of the drug war. It rose. In 1970, when Nixon declared war on drugs, approximately 24 million Americans had tried marijuana at least once. By 2000, that number had tripled. By 2020, it had nearly quadrupled. The war was fought with billions of dollars and millions of arrests and the destruction of countless lives, and at the end of it, more people were using marijuana than ever before. That is the fundamental failure of prohibition. It does not work. It has never worked. It cannot work because it is based on a misunderstanding of human nature. We knew this. We had seen it before. Alcohol prohibition, that noble experiment of the 1920s, did not stop Americans from drinking. It created a massive black market. It enriched organized crime, making gangsters like Al Capone fabulously wealthy. It killed thousands of people who drank tainted bootleg liquor because there was no quality control in an illegal market. And when the nation finally admitted failure and repealed the 18th Amendment, alcohol consumption returned to roughly where it had been before, as if prohibition had never happened. Marijuana prohibition followed the exact same pattern. By the 1970s and 1980s, domestic cultivation was exploding. In California's Emerald Triangle, the rugged counties of Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity, growers planted hidden plots deep in the forests. The remote terrain provided cover. The climate was ideal, and the economics were irresistible. The timber industry had collapsed, leaving rural communities desperate for income. A single mature marijuana plant could be worth $1,000 to $3,000 on the black market. For struggling families, for people who had lost everything when the sawmills closed, marijuana cultivation was not a criminal enterprise. It was a lifeline. The government responded with force. In 1983, California launched the campaign against marijuana planting, known as CAMP. It was a paramilitary operation in every sense. Helicopters swept over mountains, searching for the distinctive bright green of cannabis plants. Armed officers descended on rural properties, often without warrants, seizing crops and arresting growers. They carried automatic weapons. They wore body armor. They used night vision equipment to conduct raids in the darkness. The raids were terrifying. Families woke to the sound of helicopters hovering over their homes. Children watched as their parents were handcuffed and dragged away. The marijuana was destroyed, bonfires sending thick smoke into the sky. And then the officers left and the families were left to pick up the pieces. But CAMP could not stop it. For every plot that was discovered and destroyed, 10 more were planted the next season. The economics were simply too compelling. A grower who lost his crop one year could replant the next and recoup his losses within a single harvest. The risks were high, but the rewards were higher. And as long as prohibition kept prices inflated, there would always be someone willing to take those risks. The irony is bitter. Prohibition did not eliminate marijuana cultivation. It created the perfect conditions for its proliferation. Because the market was illegal, there was no quality control. Growers could use whatever pesticides they wanted, sell whatever potency they could achieve, cut their product with whatever substances they chose. Because the market was illegal, there were no age restrictions. Dealers did not ask for ID. Children could buy as easily as adults. Because the market was illegal, there was no taxation. All the profits flowed to criminals rather than to schools or roads or treatment programs. Prohibition handed the entire marijuana market to those willing to break the law, and then it acted surprised when the law could not control what it had created. South of the border, the consequences were even more catastrophic. In the 1980s, as American demand for marijuana continued to grow and domestic enforcement made cultivation riskier, Mexican cartels expanded their operations. What had been a relatively minor crop compared to opium and cocaine became a major profit center. The Sinaloa cartel, the Gulf cartel, the Juarez cartel all recognized the opportunity, and they industrialized. The hidden plots of the Emerald Triangle were nothing compared to what emerged in Mexico. Vast fields stretched across hillsides in the Sierra Madre, thousands of plants cultivated on an industrial scale. Campesinos, poor farmers desperate for income, were recruited to tend the crops. Many had no choice: work for the cartel or suffer the consequences. The violence that had defined the cocaine wars spread to marijuana. Cartels fought for control of smuggling corridors, the routes that moved product across the border into American cities. Rival organizations clashed in gun battles that left bodies in the streets. Farmers who refused to cooperate were murdered. Local police and politicians were given a simple choice: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. Between 2006 and 2020, more than 300,000 people were killed in Mexico's drug war. 300,000. That is more than the population of many American cities. Tens of thousands more simply disappeared, their bodies buried in mass graves or dissolved in acid, their families left with nothing but questions that would never be answered. Journalists who reported on the cartels were assassinated. Politicians who opposed them were gunned down in broad daylight. Entire regions of the country became effectively lawless, controlled by narco armies that outgunned the government forces sent to fight them. The violence spilled across the border, with cartels establishing distribution networks in every major American city. And a significant portion of this violence, this death, this suffering was over marijuana, a plant that half of American states would eventually legalize, a substance that millions of Americans used without incident. The blood that soaked Mexican soil, the families that were destroyed, the communities that were terrorized, all of it can be traced back to a policy decision made in Washington. We chose prohibition, and Mexico paid the price. The counterculture never really disappeared. It just went underground. Through the darkest years of the drug war, through the Reagan escalation and the Bush continuation and the mandatory minimums and the helicopter raids, a resistance persisted. It was not loud. It could not afford to be loud, but it was there, organizing, advocating, waiting for the moment when the tide might turn. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, known as NORML, had been founded in 1970. For decades, it lobbied for decriminalization, arguing in courtrooms and legislatures that the punishment for marijuana far exceeded any harm the drug might cause. High Times magazine, launched in 1974, provided a platform for cannabis culture and legalization arguments, reaching an audience of millions who shared joints and passed around dog-eared copies in dorm rooms and apartments across the country. And scientists were beginning to push back against the propaganda. In the 1990s, researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors throughout the human body that interact with compounds found in cannabis. This was not a foreign substance invading human biology. The human body was designed to interface with it. The discovery opened new avenues of research and provided scientific legitimacy to claims that had been dismissed for decades. Study after study confirmed what users had always known. Marijuana was far less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. It was not a gateway drug. The gateway theory, which claimed that marijuana led inevitably to harder substances, had been debunked. It did not cause violence. The reefer madness mythology was exactly that. Mythology. And it had legitimate medical applications for conditions ranging from chronic pain to epilepsy to the side effects of cancer treatment. The science was clear. The question was whether anyone would listen. The breakthrough came not from scientists or activists, it came from patients. In the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic swept through America, devastating communities and killing tens of thousands. The gay community, particularly in cities like San Francisco and New York, was hit hardest. Young men in the prime of their lives wasted away, their immune systems destroyed, their bodies ravaged by opportunistic infections that healthy people shrugged off without noticing. The medications available in those early years were brutal. They caused nausea so severe that patients could not eat. They destroyed appetites already weakened by illness. And as the disease progressed, the wasting syndrome set in, bodies consuming themselves as patients grew thinner and weaker by the day. But some patients discovered something. Marijuana helped. It stimulated appetite in people who could not otherwise face food. It reduced the nausea that made the medications unbearable. It provided relief from the neuropathic pain that accompanied the disease. For many, it was the difference between being able to eat, to function, to maintain some quality of life, and simply suffering until death arrived. Dennis Perron understood this personally. He was HIV positive himself. He had watched his partner, Jonathan West, waste away from AIDS, finding relief from suffering only through marijuana. And when Jonathan died, Perron decided to fight. In 1992, he opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club. It was the first public marijuana dispensary in the United States, operating openly despite its obvious illegality. Patients could come in, show documentation of their illness, and purchase marijuana in a safe, controlled environment. Local authorities, seeing the humanitarian dimension, largely looked the other way. But Perron wanted more than tolerance. He wanted legality. He drafted Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, a ballot initiative that would allow patients with a doctor's recommendation to legally use marijuana for medical purposes. It was a direct challenge to federal prohibition. The establishment fought back hard. The Drug Enforcement Administration threatened to arrest any doctor who recommended marijuana. The Clinton administration warned that federal law superseded state law, and that nothing California did would protect patients from federal prosecution. Opponents ran advertisements warning that Proposition 215 was just a backdoor to full legalization, that it would lead to marijuana stores on every corner. They were right about that last part. On November 5th, 1996, California voters approved Proposition 215 with 56% of the vote. California became the first state in the nation to legalize medical marijuana. The dam had cracked. Other states followed, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Oregon and Washington passed medical marijuana laws in 1998. Alaska and Maine followed in 1999. By 2010, 15 states had legalized medical marijuana in some form. By 2020, that number had risen to 36 states plus the District of Columbia. Medical marijuana had gone from radical proposal to mainstream policy in less than a generation. The industry that emerged operated in a legal gray zone that defied easy description. These were businesses that were fully legal under state law, but completely illegal under federal law. They could not use banks because banks feared federal prosecution for handling drug money. They paid their taxes in cash, their employees in cash, their suppliers in cash. They operated dispensaries that looked like Apple stores, sleek and modern and professional, while technically existing in the same legal category as heroin dealers. And yet they thrived. thrived. The medical marijuana industry generated billions of dollars in revenue, even operating under these impossible conditions. Patients lined up, entrepreneurs invested, jobs were created, tax revenue flowed to state coffers. But medical marijuana was also clearly a stepping stone. In California particularly, the dispensary system became a thinly veiled mechanism for recreational access. Getting a medical recommendation was trivially easy. Walk-in clinics would issue them after consultations lasting 5 minutes or less. Bad back? Recommendation. Anxiety? Recommendation. Trouble sleeping? Recommendation. The medical framework provided legal cover, but everyone understood what was really happening. The real battle, the end game, was full legalization, and that battle was about to be won. The legalization campaigns in Colorado and Washington in 2012 were unlike anything that had come before. They were carefully orchestrated, well-funded, and strategically brilliant. The activists behind them had learned from decades of failure. They knew exactly what they needed to do. First, they changed the messenger. Previous legalization efforts had been led by counterculture figures, people who looked and sounded like exactly what opponents expected marijuana advocates to look like. The 2012 campaigns put forward soccer moms and law enforcement officers, teachers and small business owners. They looked like the people next door because they were. Second, they changed the message. They did not talk about personal freedom or the right to get high. They talked about practicality. They talked about failure. Prohibition has failed. It has cost billions of dollars in enforcement. It has destroyed millions of lives through incarceration. And it has not stopped anyone from using marijuana. The demand is there. The supply is there. All prohibition has done is hand the entire market to criminals. Legalization means regulation. It means taxation. It means control. It means taking the market away from cartels and gangs and putting it in the hands of licensed, regulated businesses that check IDs and pay taxes. It means treating marijuana like alcohol, legal for adults, regulated for safety, kept away from children through the same mechanisms that keep alcohol away from children. The message resonated. It met voters where they were, appealing not to ideology but to common sense. On November 6, 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington approved ballot measures to legalize recreational marijuana for adults 21 and over. It was a historic moment. For the first time in modern history, jurisdictions had voted to fully legalize cannabis through a democratic process. Not decriminalization, not medical exceptions, full legalization. The federal government's response was uncertain. Marijuana remained Schedule 1 under federal law. The DEA could have cracked down, raided dispensaries, arrested growers and sellers. But the Obama administration, reading the political winds, chose a different path. In 2013, the Justice Department issued the Cole Memorandum, which essentially declared that the federal government would not interfere with state legalization efforts as long as states maintained strict regulatory controls and prevented marijuana from crossing state lines or reaching minors. It was not an endorsement. It was not legalization. But it was permission to proceed. The floodgates opened. Alaska and Oregon legalized in 2014. California, Nevada, Maine, and Massachusetts followed in 2016. Canada legalized nationwide in 2018, becoming the first major industrialized nation to do so. By 2025, more than half of American states had legalized recreational marijuana, and 2/3 had legalized medical use. The legal marijuana industry exploded. By 2020, legal sales in the United States exceeded $17 billion. By 2023, that number had surged past $30 billion. Dispensaries proliferated, their sleek interiors displaying products with the precision of a jewelry store. Cultivation facilities covered acres, industrial operations producing tons of marijuana annually. Processing labs extracted concentrates. Edible manufacturers created gummies and chocolates and beverages. Testing laboratories verified potency and checked for contaminants. Wall Street noticed. Publicly traded cannabis companies appeared on major stock exchanges. Venture capital poured in. Celebrities launched their own brands. Snoop Dogg, Willie Nelson, Mike Tyson, Whoopi Goldberg. Names that would have been career-ending associations a generation earlier became marketing assets. The plant that had been demonized for a century was now being embraced by capitalism. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and its totality. But transformation is not the same as justice, and the story was far from over. We live now in a country of contradictions so profound they border on the absurd. Marijuana remains, as of this moment, a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law, the same classification as heroin. The official position of the United States government is that cannabis has no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This is the law of the land. And yet legal marijuana markets operate in more than half of American states. Billions of dollars change hands. Millions of customers walk into dispensaries, browse products, make purchases, and walk out carrying substances that federal law considers as dangerous as heroin. The disconnect between federal classification and ground-level reality has grown so vast that it has become almost impossible to comprehend. This limbo creates consequences that ripple through every aspect of the industry. Banks, fearing federal prosecution for money laundering, refuse to work with cannabis businesses. Dispensaries that generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in monthly revenue operate almost entirely in cash. They pay their employees in cash. They pay their taxes in cash. They store cash in safes that make them targets for robbery. The accounting nightmares alone would sink most businesses. And then there is Section 280E of the Internal Revenue Code, a provision designed to prevent drug traffickers from deducting business expenses. Because marijuana remains federally illegal, cannabis companies cannot deduct what every other business deducts: rent, salaries, utilities, marketing, administrative costs. They can only deduct the direct cost of goods sold. The result is effective tax rates that can exceed 70%. Businesses operate on razor-thin margins, crushed by a tax code that treats them as criminals. States collect billions in marijuana tax revenue. The federal government simultaneously punishes these same businesses with confiscatory taxation and denial of basic financial services. The contradiction is absurd, and yet it persists. Here is the bitter truth at the heart of legalization. The people getting rich are not the people who suffered. The cannabis industry is overwhelmingly white. The executives, the investors, the entrepreneurs launching brands and building empires, they come from the same demographics that were largely protected from the drug war's worst consequences. They had the capital to secure licenses. They had the connections to navigate regulatory mazes. They had the luxury of taking risks that would have been unthinkable for those who spent decades watching their communities destroyed by prohibition. The people who went to prison for marijuana, overwhelmingly black and brown. The people whose lives were derailed by convictions, who lost jobs and housing and educational opportunities, who watched their families torn apart. Overwhelmingly from the same communities that law enforcement targeted for generations. The barriers to entry in the legal cannabis market are enormous. Licenses often cost hundreds of thousands of dollars just to apply, with no guarantee of approval. Regulatory compliance requires sophisticated legal teams, accounting systems, security infrastructure. Starting a legal cannabis business requires millions of dollars in capital. And where does that capital come from? Not from communities that were devastated by the drug war, not from families that lost everything to prohibition. Some states have attempted to address this through social equity programs, offering priority licensing or reduced fees to applicants from communities disproportionately impacted by marijuana enforcement. The intention is admirable. The execution has been disastrous. Insufficient funding, bureaucratic delays that stretch for years, and fronting fraud where wealthy investors use minority partners as faces to secure social equity status before pushing them out once the licenses are obtained. And the arrests continue. In 2020, even as the pandemic raged, more than 350,000 Americans were arrested for marijuana offenses. That is one arrest every 90 seconds. The majority were for simple possession. In states that have not legalized, the drug war grinds on as if nothing has changed. The drug war is not history. It is happening right now in courtrooms and jail cells across the country, even as dispensaries rake in billions a few states away. Legalization advocates promised that regulation would protect public health more effectively than prohibition. The evidence on this is complicated. The marijuana available today is not the marijuana of the 1970s. In that era, the average THC content of cannabis was around 2 to 3%. Today, flower commonly reaches 25 to 30% THC. Concentrates, the oils and waxes and shatters that have become increasingly popular, can exceed 90%. This is not your grandparents' weed. This is a fundamentally different product, and the health implications are still being studied. There is growing evidence that high-potency marijuana use is associated with mental health problems, particularly among adolescents and young adults. Regular use of high THC products has been linked to increased rates of psychosis and may trigger schizophrenia in individuals with genetic vulnerability. Cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, a condition characterized by severe cyclical vomiting in heavy users, was virtually unknown a generation ago. It is now a regular presence in emergency rooms. Edibles present their own challenges. They look like candy. They taste like candy. Children who find them cannot distinguish them from regular treats. Emergency room visits for accidental pediatric cannabis ingestion have risen in legalization states. Adults, too, misjudge edibles. The effects are delayed, sometimes by an hour or more. Someone takes a gummy, feels nothing, takes another, and finds themselves overwhelmed for hours. These are solvable problems. Better packaging, clearer dosing guidelines, more public education, but solving them requires prioritizing public health over profit. And the industry has been slow to make that choice. The dream of many legalization advocates was a cottage industry. Small growers, artisan producers, craft cannabis that rewarded quality and expertise over scale and capital, a marketplace as diverse and vibrant as craft beer or local wineries. The reality is increasingly a corporate oligopoly. Large multi-state operators have emerged, companies like Curaleaf and Trulieve and Green Thumb Industries. They buy up licenses across jurisdictions. They build massive cultivation facilities that achieve economies of scale no small grower can match. They establish vertical integration, controlling everything from seed to sale, and they push out the smaller operators who cannot compete on price or volume. These corporations are racing to establish dominance before federal legalization arrives. When interstate commerce becomes legal, when marijuana can move freely across state lines, the companies positioned with capital, infrastructure, and market share will win. They will become the Anheuser-Busch or Philip Morris of cannabis. The craft producers, the small growers who risked everything for decades, will be crushed by industrial agriculture. Legalization is not a victory for counterculture. It is not a triumph of rebellion over authority. It is the commodification of something that was once transgressive, the absorption of cannabis into the same corporate structures that dominate every other industry. And yet, Legalization, for all its failures and compromises, remains preferable to what came before. Prohibition was not merely a policy failure, it was an atrocity. It filled prisons to bursting. It cost taxpayers trillions of dollars. It enriched criminal organizations beyond imagination. It militarized police departments. It shattered the trust between law enforcement and the communities they claimed to serve. It violated constitutional rights on a massive scale. And it was built on lies. From the very beginning, lies told knowingly by people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. True justice would require more than legalization. It would require expunging every marijuana conviction, automatically and completely. It would require releasing every person still imprisoned for offences that are no longer crimes. It would require compensating those who lost years of their lives to incarceration. It would require investing billions of dollars in the communities that were targeted, rebuilding what was destroyed. It would require dismantling the structures of the drug war, the militarized police, the asset forfeiture laws, the mandatory minimums that filled cells for profit. Some of this is happening slowly, incompletely. Much of it is not. The political will remains weak. The powerful interests that benefit from the status quo remain powerful. The marijuana industry is being built on the ruins of the drug war, and the people who profit from legalization are not the people who suffered from prohibition. That injustice does not erase itself. It sits at the center of every dispensary, every investment round, every celebrity brand, an unpaid debt that grows larger with each passing day. So what is marijuana, really? Strip away the century of propaganda. Strip away the decades of prohibition. Strip away the current haze of marketing and branding and celebrity endorsements. What remains? A plant. A remarkably versatile plant with a relationship to humanity that stretches back to the earliest days of agriculture. For 10,000 years, this plant has been our partner. It fed us when we were hungry. Its seeds rich with protein and oil. It clothed us when we were cold. Its fibers woven into fabric that lasted generations. It healed us when we were sick, easing pain and calming tremors and settling stomachs. It altered our consciousness, opening doors to experiences that sober minds could not reach. It inspired creativity, loosened inhibitions, helped us see the world in different ways. It is not harmless. No psychoactive substance is harmless. It can be abused. It can impair judgment and coordination. It can affect vulnerable individuals in ways that cause genuine harm. It should be regulated, controlled, approached with the same respect we give to alcohol and tobacco and prescription medications. The people who claim marijuana is perfectly safe are not telling the whole truth, but it is also not the demon it was made out to be. It does not cause violence. The reefer madness was always a lie. It does not lead inevitably to harder drugs. The gateway theory was propaganda, not science. For many people, millions of people, it provides genuine relief from pain, from anxiety, from the side effects of serious illness. It is a mild intoxicant, no more dangerous than a glass of wine. The question of marijuana has never really been about the plant itself. It has been about who uses it, who controls it, who profits from it. The same plant that was celebrated when it made rope for the Navy was demonized when Mexican immigrants smoked it. The same plant that sat in every pharmacy in 1900 was criminalized when black jazz musicians embraced it. The same plant that sent millions to prison for decades is now making investors rich. This is not about pharmacology. This is about power. The story of marijuana is the story of how societies decide what is acceptable and what is forbidden. Those decisions are not made by evidence. They are not made by science. They are made by fear, by prejudice, by political convenience, by the interests of those who hold power and wish to keep it. The plant will survive regardless of what we decide. It has survived 10,000 years of human history. It will survive whatever comes next, growing in hidden valleys and industrial warehouses, in backyard gardens and remote mountainsides. Cannabis is patient. Cannabis endures. The question is not about the plant. The question is about us. What kind of society do we want to be? Can we face our history honestly, acknowledge the damage that was done, the lives that were destroyed, the lies that were told? Can we learn from our failures? Can we build something better, something more just, something that does not repeat the same patterns of control and exploitation? The story of marijuana is not over. We are living in it. We are writing it right now with every law we pass, every dispensary we open, every person we release from prison or leave behind bars. The ending has not been written. It is up to us to decide what it will be.